So, in this final lecture for this week, how is a systematic ideology different from just plain old opinion? The difference is in the term systematic. Socialists and communists have books that explain how socialism works, how society works. The most famous of these is Karl Marx's Das Kapital, which explains the nature of social classes, the role of the proletariat, which is the urban working class, factory workers, in being the vanguard of the revolution, explains that history has three eras: the feudal era, the capitalist era, and then the socialist utopia to come, and how religion is the opiate, the drug of the masses to keep them obedient, and all of these other things that Marx contends. You don't have to agree with him. I sure don't. But there's a systematic logic to it all. It holds together as a set of ideas that together explain the world. In that sense, it's similar to a religious doctrine. In fact, communism has many of the hallmarks of a religion. It has a priesthood, the Communist Party. It has a God, which is the physical representation of humanity living in utopian peace. That is the goal, that is the utopia, that's their heaven, that's their purpose, that is effectively their God. And it has its dogma, which is explained in Das Kapital, and literally dozens and dozens, hundreds and thousands really, of other books. It is a thoroughgoing way of looking at the world that if you join, you tend to have to accept everything. Churches are like that. Communism is like that. And to a lesser degree, and to a different degree, with certain different books, different ideals, socialism is like that. Not all socialists are dialectical. Not all socialists believe in a violent revolution. Communists do. But socialists can believe in evolutionary progress and change. And American progressives meet socialists in that evolutionary approach to making society and people better and better over time. Whereas conservatives suspect that you, as a human being, cannot make yourself fundamentally and intrinsically better by overcoming your own human nature as a group of people. An individual can change, but you cannot make people be saved. You cannot make people be saved. So that's a difference. And conservatives believe that because of a totally different way of looking at the world. Some conservatives are systematically ideological. They have a balanced way of approach, a way of looking at society and life that deals with religion, economics, politics, warfare, culture, education, the family. The whole 9 yards is wrapped up into this box, which is the ideology of certain conservatives, just as socialists and communists have the world explained in their own little box filled with ideas. Opinion is a lot more beguess and begory. Opinion is a lot more casual and pragmatic. Opinion is what is my prejudice, my self-interest, what does my education and experience tell me about the world. And opinion can produce people who have ideas that to systematically ideological people are mutually incompatible. In other words, libertarians. Libertarians start out being completely anti-systematic, and then they become systematic themselves, saying that the most important thing is personal choice. Personal choice socially, which liberals agree with, personal choice economically, which conservatives agree with. Libertarians combine these both together. But before libertarianism became a common ideal, before it became a more systematic ideology, individuals who argued for both social and political freedom tended to, and economic freedom and openness tended to be looked at strangely by others because it didn't make sense that you could have both of these ideas together, like a Reese's peanut butter cup of politics. So opinion is different from a systematic ideology, and that opinion tends to be more issue by issue, candidate by candidate, and idiosyncratic. whereas systematic ideologues tend to think systematically and vote for the party, not so much the candidate, and the ideology that the party stands for. That's the system of ideas. Systematic ideology is a system of ideas, and vote for the ideology and more than the party or the individual, because the party and the individual candidate is going to push that ideological set of policies when they are in office. Now, the final thing in my notes for this week for you guys is systematic ideology in American politics. Throughout the last, well, since the Civil War certainly, and really a little bit since before, American politics tends to be fundamentally different from the politics that you get in a lot of other free countries. In Ireland, in Britain, in Israel, in France, in Germany, in Japan, and in many other countries, it's a parliamentary system that builds coalition governments. So they'll have a communist party, socialist party, maybe a social democratic party, a moderate central party, a moderate conservative party, a hard conservative party, and maybe even fascists or monarchists or ultramontane religious-oriented Catholics that have political ambitions, which is true in some, like France and Spain. And what happens is you've got a parliament with half a dozen or more political parties, each of which has a narrow, usually systematic ideology. And what happens during elections is usually nobody gets a majority of votes. So parties then negotiate with one another as to, will we form a coalition that will come together and vote together to govern? And usually in these countries that have parliamentary democracies, Israel, Germany, Britain, France, Japan, Ireland, and so forth, the government isn't a single political party. It's a coalition of a variety of parties that gather together for practical power and for certain shared ideas. So when those shared ideas are at stake, they vote together. When those shared ideas are not present, they might still vote differently, and you have a fracturing. Coalition parliamentary democracy tends to focus on the extremes, making sure that people who are hardcore communists have a place to go. People who are fascists have a place to go. People who are in the center have a place to go. Social Democrats and conservative Republicans, or the equivalents, have places to go. That's not the way America has organized its political system. What we have are two broad parties. The Republican Party is center-right. That means it's moderate to conservative. There are more conservative parties out there, but they tend to be fringe. There's also fascists out there that have nothing to do with mainstream Republican values any more than communists have to do with mainstream Democrat values. So the Republican Party is a broad party. It's not a coalition of little identity-oriented parties. It is a broad party that tends to reflect an economic conservatism that tends to limit government action and tends to reflect a more traditional way of looking at society and social norms. The Democrat Party is another broad party. It is a party that includes the urban poor. It includes various identity groups, ethnic groups, gender groups that tend to be liberal. It's a center-left party, or it has been. Bernie Sanders is a hardcore socialist. He is a democratic socialist. He's not even properly a member of the Democrat Party. But the Democrat Party traditionally, with the exception of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and people like that, tend to embrace sort of center-left ideas. So they try to appeal to moderates as well as liberals and progressives who aren't too extreme. Now, what the American system has tended to give us over the last, let's see, 1850s to 2020s, that's 170 years, that's a long time, is a political system that's not very volatile. In all of these parliamentary coalition democracies that exist in Ireland, from Ireland to Israel and Japan and beyond, the hardcore differences between the systematic ideologies of all these little parties tend to make things much more extreme. Democrats and Republicans traditionally have somewhat slightly different emphases, different ways of governing. But it wasn't really until the late 1990s and the early 2000s that we begin to get the kind of intense political divide that we have now. What we have now is still a system of two broad parties, center-right Republicans, center-left Democrats, that are designed to appeal to moderates and vast majorities of American voters. They're not very extreme, they're not very systematic, they're not very ideological one way or the other. Most libertarians tend to vote Republican in a general election. Most socialists tend to vote Democrat rather than Green for the Green Party in a general election. Why? Because it's much more likely that the Republican or Democrat might win, and between those two candidates you pick the lesser evil. Or you pick the guy who agrees with your belief the most, to a limited degree. In the current intensifyingly partisan atmosphere that we see in the United States, this system of having broadly centrist parties, center-left, Democrat, center-right, Republican, may not last. We don't know. The American people could become more moderate again and say you win some, you lose some, and when we have power, we're not going to push things to the limit. We'll sort of govern and move things a little our way, and when you govern, you'll move things a little your way, and things will basically remain in the center. But if both parties continue to nominate or emphasize people and ideas that basically say winner take all, we're going to fundamentally change the country, either by returning it to what it may have been at one time 60, 70 years ago in the past, or by making it like social democratic Western Europe. At that point, the calm that most Americans have had about our politics, that yeah, okay, I'm a Republican, Bill Clinton gets elected. It's not great, but it's not the end of the world. I'm a Republican, Jimmy Carter gets elected. It's not great, it's not the end of the world. You're a Democrat, George Bush or George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan get elected. It's not the end of the world. But now, because both parties are moving, at least parts, they seem to be moving away from a broad consensus in the center of American politics towards the extremes, Democrats really worry about Republicans destroying the country. And Republicans really worry about the same thing. That's not good for our politics. So, thank you for your attention this week. Please make a comment on each and every video. Thoughtful. I miss you all. Take care.